Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the People and Dancefloors podcast. I think I'm going to call this season 2 because it's been quite a while since we did the last recording. And I'm super excited about our guest today, but also I'm not alone as a host. I've got my research partner, Karen Mamo, who I've been doing research with in Malta. Hi, Karen. And then we have as our guest today Dr. Fabian Steinmetz, who is, who's a lot of interesting things. He's a toxicologist, but also he is an advocate of evidence-based drug policy, but also harm reduction. And I always really like, the combination between kind of hard and serious science alongside the kind of more, I don't know, harm reduction or kind of rights-based discussions around drug policy reform. So yeah, welcome, Fabian. You're also a member of ENCOD, which is the European Coalition for Just and Effective Drug Policies. Now, actually, you said are you the president-elect?
Yeah, yeah.
Was that a secret?
I'm just awaiting to this point. So first of all, yeah, thanks for having me here. It's still a weird kind of feeling, to won the election, but now I don't know as when I can call myself president because ENCOD is currently moving from Belgium to Austria. Moving closer to the enemy, the UN. We will get you. But yeah, at some point, if nothing very awkward will happen, yeah, I'll be the president of ENCOD.
Amazing. I mean, I thought I just revealed a big secret. I was like, oh, I shouldn't have said anything.
I hope I didn't reveal any big secret, but I don't think so. We're usually quite transparent. It's, more prohibition, more the prohibitionists are the ones who are hiding information.
Fair enough. But yeah, basically, yeah, I just want to know more about your background, yourself, like how you came to work in this field and become interested in drug policy, I guess.
Yeah, I think, mainly two things led together. I mean, the one thing is I always then from school I was always interested in biology, natural sciences, and particularly then when I also learned how certain substances act on the human mind, I was also very interested in this particularly biological field. While after school, I was then going more to the pragmatic science, to the practical sciences, doing my first degree in engineering, chemical engineering. I later on went into the pharmaceutical industry and did an MSc in toxicology. And then I was researching in the field of structure-activity relationships. So extrapolating from the chemistry of a substance to its biological effects, particularly if there are data gaps. And yeah, particularly in drugs, particularly designer drugs, novel psychoactive substances, they are full of data gaps because no one is actually interested in studying them. But also natural plant drugs, there's a lot of data, but a lot of it is quite old, or let's say the methods are not very typical for pharmacological, toxicological studies. This has a bit to do with the fact that plant medicine, you can't patent that well, and so it's less interesting for the pharmaceutical industry. So this is also where there are a lot of data gaps, and I mean, this is really a type of thinking I identify myself, because looking at a chemical compound and trying to say something about it based on computational models, based on different tool sets I use, this makes you actually very objective. Because if you're just looking at different opioids and their chemistry, you don't have names with them because you only look at the chemistry. And then you actually learn that heroin, for example, is weaker than oxycodone, and oxycodone is used by millions of people against pain, and heroin, which is even a bit weaker, is this drama drug. This being able to study in the field of drug design and structure activity relationship and read across. That's sometimes what you is a technique how to fill data gaps in toxicology. This actually helps me to say provocative statements like, I would take heroin against headaches. Of course, an oral pill and only low milligram quantities, but you know, that's a bit my background and where I come from.
So it sounds like you are just reveling in the idea that you could debunk myths around, you know, some substances being kind of assumed to be the most dangerous, whereas actually others were, you know, either not very well understood or known about in terms of their potential kind of, you know, composition and therefore associated dangers or harms. And you know, there's a typical thing of like, oh, you know, these kind of demon drugs that we consider to be the most grave and dangerous and harmful, and then there's like all these prescribed drugs and freely, you know, easily available drugs that are actually potentially more dangerous. Yeah, that's great that you're able to kind of put more, you know, look at the real science behind that, because I think that there's still massive misunderstandings around this, and most people just assume that, you know, heroin is the worst drug and, you know, nothing compares to it and whatnot. Yeah. So yeah, so what about the drug policy stuff? So obviously you've told me about the kind of your I guess your research and your research interests, but what about drug policy?
Yeah. So probably this whole thing started, you know, as a teenage pothead, skateboarding and listening to metal. I always felt a bit unjust that, you know, I came from a famous wine producing valley with a lot of villages where, you know, it's celebrated very much, the wine culture. Riesling from the Mosel. It's so it's I always felt it's a bit unjust that I could lose very much if if police would catch me with a little bit of cannabis or with an ecstasy pill or with whatever. So this is where I always felt the injustice, and I thought maybe if I get educated in this field, I maybe get something to say in this area. But then actually, while digging deeper, and this happened for me within the last 5 years maybe. I actually learned people in social sciences, particularly, but also lawyers and people from education. They actually much more against drug prohibition than natural scientists like myself, or toxicologists, pharmacologists, etc. They very often don't care that much, but it's those people who actually see how harmful this whole law enforcement is and how much harm unregulated markets are causing. So within the last couple of years, probably every second study I was reading them from social scientists and or from public health experts, etc. And this was very interesting and opened my eyes, and and also strengthened my view that there is always a better regulatory model than prohibition. And yeah, this is this is why I talk, at least, that there has to be some sort of decriminalization, there has to be drug checking, there has to be safe supply, so different substitution models, etc. That's why I'm really in favor of those kind of things. And I'm afraid there are not many like-minded with the same scientific background than I am. So I don't know that many. Most have a different scientific background.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few people in like I guess neuropharmacology, that famous people in that field, some kind of like. So there's a few people there, but it's not enough. There's not enough, like, especially natural scientists. There's a lot of criminologists, but nobody cares about what criminologists say anyway. They're not, in the kind of ranking and hierarchy of experts, we come quite low, in terms of, like how sciencey are we, how reliable and objective and so on. We're not really trusted as social scientists, so we need more people like yourself to advocate for reform.
I'm always losing against physicians. That's it's not even. There was recently on Twitter a physician saying some nonsense, and I was kind of correcting him, and he was immediately, you don't have any patients, you don't know how much they're suffering, and I'm just trying to explain them, yeah, but it won't get better by poor quality, miseducation, and penalties and discrimination and all this kind of stuff.
I think if I may add something from Malta, this whole past discussion about cannabis, I think even the social sciences here are still pretty much entrenched in the idea that drugs are bad and should be not criminalized, but at least the person should be kept away and sent to treatment, because practically every organization in Malta, from the medical, from the legal not so much, but medical, economic, and psychological and social sciences, they all were against any type of decriminalized system, although stating that they don't want to see people going to prison for a joint. Then when it comes to discussing grams and different behaviors, there's huge opposition on the preset that is going to be normalized. And I think this kind of different also levels of how different sciences approach drug use in a society, I think it's very reflective also of different positions countries take also on other issues related to, for example, youth or entertainment, or things that are maybe accepted but in a way try to kept hidden. It depends also a bit, I think, on the history of the country, because I wanted to bring this example up.
and how conservative the population is. This is so, you know, a lot of people were actually surprised that Malta has such a progressive cannabis law, because the use prevalence is not huge, and also usually you see, you know, if there's high numbers of strongly religious people, this is also rather, you know, goes rather than in a prohibitionist way.
And the most, I think, surprising part was that no social science organization or group talked about the negative effects of a criminalized system and how people had their lives ruined and all that. And it was a bit surprising in a way, because it seemed that the academia here does not look at that part of the whole picture, and some people were actually promoting that kind of as a deterrent to use less drugs. Kind of there's law enforcement involved, which actually does not exactly. But I think these kind of ideas how to address drugs are slowly getting shifted, but there are still a lot of experts that are really fixated in thinking that prohibition is the best way to address drug use in society.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I wasn't necessarily suggesting that also social scientists believe in drug policy reform, or like even all criminologists, but there's definitely, you know, I'd say at least in the UK context, there's definitely a kind of an established understanding from lots of different people doing work, you know, within the criminology field beyond drug policy. So, you know, looking at prisons, looking at race, looking at inequalities and so on, you know, so that the evidence is coming in from all these different places. And I think that the issue of prisons and race has been a catalyst for enabling people to talk about drug policy being a failure, you know, along other things. But and I think that issue is particularly prevalent in kind of liberal countries, or, you know, countries that have a history of colonialism. So there's other kind of pressing issues that might be kind of pushing, you know, drug policy onto the political agenda, or at least that kind of, people that come to drug policy reform through a different route. But anyway, going back to what Fabian was saying, I was really fascinated about the fact that you're talking about the kind of like the feeling of like injustice, or I guess inequality in the kind of celebration of wine versus the kind of stigmatization, I guess, of drugs like cannabis or maybe ecstasy. And it's interesting that you also talk about yourself as like somebody who used drugs, at least in your youth. And that's really, I think that's really, again, quite a revolutionary thing, because a lot of academics, a lot of professionals or academics, they don't want to acknowledge themselves as drug users or as past or present drug users.
Yeah. I mean, you won't get more than me from some anecdotes decades ago, because it's still, whatever you say, the problem is you can only do it wrong. If you say that you have never used drugs, people say, "Oh, you don't know how dangerous they are. You cannot judge about this." And if you say, "Yeah, no, I tried most of the stuff," and so on, then people kind of say, "Oh, you're only for a drug policy reform because you want to have access to better drugs." Whatever you say, they will take it against you. And this is why I usually don't argue with this. And I mean, this was just a side note, an anecdote I put here. And I usually also only do little anecdotes, which are a very long time ago, because it does not have anything to do with the reason I'm for drug policy reform. I mean, my motivation is because we know that, for example, heroin-assisted treatment, giving heroin to people who use heroin anyway, this saves lives. If we offer drug checking, of course, our kids and friends or whatever, they should not pop pills and snort powders in a club, bought from the black market. And but at least if they do it, then they should still come home safe again. And they can do this safer if they roughly have an idea: is this ketamine or cocaine, or is this a pill containing 300 milligrams of MDMA or just 100 milligrams of MDMA? So my motivation is always harm reduction and human rights. And with human rights, there's also something, because I'm very often misquoted on that. When I say human rights, it's not the human rights to take drugs. That's an argument on its own. You can debate, is there a human right for taking drugs? I would say rather yes and no. But when I say human rights, I mean human rights like freedom. A person should be free despite using drugs. That's more what they should not lose their right to, live their happy life in their family, go to work, have a normal life, if they just replace one legal substance to an illegal substance. So that's more what I mean with human rights. So this is why, from time to time, maybe a funny anecdote, but I usually rarely talk about personal experience. So.
No, I completely understand where you're coming from. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. And then, like, in some cases, your like any admission of drug taking, past and present, might actually, essentially cause for people to call you self-interested when you're arguing for reform, which is a nightmare. But anyway, the point is, I think human rights and harm reduction is a good summary of the kind of values that inform your approach to drug policy. So thank you for that. And I very much espouse those values myself, and I'm sure Karen does too. But also, I'm thinking human rights also in relation to like the right not to die from adulterated or from unknown kind of the unknown contents of the drug supply and so on. And yeah, I just think the right to safety and so on, even beyond freedom, I think is important.
And if I may add something to this, it made me also think that presently there is this idea that a person that used to use drugs and today is clean. I don't really like this word, but yes, is today no longer using an illicit substance, but better, are promoted and kind of encouraged to come forward and speak. And especially in the past cannabis debate, we have seen in Malta a lot of people who declared that they were that they faced a heroin problem or a cocaine problem, and obviously they started from cannabis, and they again repeat things which they hear, and they were explained by people who are providing treatment. And I think these testimonies are in a way reinforcing the idea, certain ideas linked with drug use, that every drug use will lead to problematic substance use, that it will lead to a life of crime and prison. And from a harm reduction perspective, I feel really sad for these people. And because I know that deep down they believe that they're speaking to do well, but in reality, their message is not really contributing too much, especially if a person, for example, is facing a problem, hearing someone recounting a personal experience and then generalizing it to the whole drug using population is working against that person. So I think hopefully in maybe other discussions about drugs in Malta, there will be a better understanding of different views and different people who use drugs, and not only people who have stopped now.
Very important. I also think that sometimes people who used to have a substance use disorder, they sometimes buy the concepts they have been told to. So they have something to blame. And also if they don't use this drug ever again, they have something to be proud of. And this is actually giving them something on a psychological level. They think that cannabis or heroin or whatever was responsible for their issues, although poverty and underlying depression, whatever issues are the cause. And this was actually a remedy. Of course, there would have been a better treatment option. I mean, if there would be a better medical care, there might have been a better therapy. But I really hate it when people really say from their personal perspective, oh, now I know how bad things are, I understood it. I think they have been misindicated on this topic. And so I also am a big fan of people who admit drug use. I mean, not in an advertising sense, but still, I think for me as a teenager, it was very important that I knew that there can be stoners who still become scientists and so on. I mean, maybe not people who constantly use dozens of drugs all the time. Although, I mean, there might be still some exceptions, but at least I think it's very important that you have role models, even role models who take drugs. And I think it's very bad telling kids that they. I mean, that's the current narrative of if you take cannabis, if you are below 25, you're damaging your brain. It's not true. I mean, there are certain associations, and to a certain extent, maybe cannabis has a negative influence. Yes, but telling this to kids, my favorite, you can quote me on this because I say this all the time in different versions. A joint cannot make as much damage as reading a book can do good. So people need to find a balance. And I think the main issue with cannabis and youngsters smoking a lot of cannabis is if they constantly are smoking cannabis and therefore not doing anything else. So reading no books, doing no other activities, don't go out in nature and trying to determine different plants and fungi. That's what I do during Corona. I don't have a better example. Other people learn languages. I learn plants and fungi, mushrooms. So and maybe just because you said that it's kind of brave that I kind of am outing myself. I'm a joke against Professor Dr. Karl Hart, famous neurobiologist. He wrote in his book that he is sometimes recreational snorting heroin. Sorry, I cannot compete with this by saying that I was a teenage pothead.
Yeah, I mean, he is pretty out there with the experiences, but yeah. Yeah, I just think it's, you know, I think what annoys me the most is that the only narrative that is platform is that redemption narrative. That's like, I used to be a drug user, now I no longer use drugs, and therefore I can now speak about my experiences, and that's the only role model that we're allowed to have as far as drug use goes. And or there's like some kind of, you know, cultural representations in like music and film that it's like, oh, the artist who is like also a drug user, but that's kind of as far as we go. And I think it's reductive because it's yeah, of course you want to know that there's a, you know, potheads can be like scientists or whatever whatever they want to be.
Yeah, also some musicians occasionally smoke cannabis.
Just like, yeah, definitely.
Just a few.
Yeah. Cool.
Maybe, I mean, why you have a toxicologist online? Maybe I can say a sentence. Why I don't like the terminology clean? Because it gives you the impression that, you know, the opposite would be dirty. It gives you the impression that there's a substance in your system which is somehow harmful. But I mean, you absorb a substance somehow. It's in your blood. It's you know, it's distributing there. When you're on acid, actually the concentration in your brain is more or less the same concentration than in your little pinky or your toe. So there's a kind of distribution, and, you know, it all goes through kidney and liver and gets metabolized and excreted over, for example, urine, feces, etc. So, by the way, it's much easier in the feces to determine cannabinoids in urine. So maybe we should recommend this to the police.
Yeah, they're constantly doing urine sample, like, you know, like yeah.
Yeah, and there they measure the metabolite of which is not associated with impairment. I think this is even in Malta today. We wrote an article where this is kind of expressed, that this test, if someone is hasn't smoked for a long time and then smoked and then tested, so this person is, let's say, high as a kite, and then this person, this test will be negative. Yeah. On the other hand, the person who smoked the day before and was completely sober, the test will be positive. So there are false positive and false negatives due to those urine tests. But the metabolite itself is not harmful. I'm just sipping here on a cup of tea. There's a psychoactive substance in called caffeine. And there are also metabolites of caffeine in my blood. Am I now not clean due to caffeine? Am I not clean due to the metabolites of caffeine? And what if people could find metabolites in my urine from caffeine? What would it say about any, you know, problematic use or me being impaired or whatever? It's ridiculous. The same with, for example, morphine. If you, for example, consume heroin, it's the actually deacetylated versions, including morphine, but mainly the 6-acetyl morphine, which are actually the active parts which are acting on your opioid receptors. But you have floating around morphine and morphine metabolites in your body when you consume heroin. My aunt or my mother, when they are in, let's say they have a pain medication in based on morphine, they have exactly the same substances in their blood. So I'm not even comparing people who stopped using heroin. I'm talking about the active heroin user and my mother or my aunt with pain medications in their blood. They have exactly the same substances in their blood. If you tell this heroin user, oh, you're not clean, you're telling the same about my mom. And how dare you talking about my mom? I mean, I think this whole narrative about clean and not clean is very, very, it's driven by very unscientific thoughts. Of course, I'm careful. If someone tells me, you know, I had a problem with, you know, I had a heroin use disorder and I stopped using heroin for 6 months, you know, they still get a shoulder clap from me. And, you know, I don't tell them, oh yeah, your wording is not that scientific. So, I mean, they still get some props for, you know, getting control over problematic use they had before. But if people use this in other contexts, yeah, I think particularly experts, so physicians and people who work in social care, etc., they should not use this wording anymore.
I fully agree. And I've tried also to kind of explain why the terminology clean is not appropriate. However, every time I was given the reply that it's actually a benefit because it's something to look forward to. So there I could see that actually they could not really understand, as you were saying, that the opposite of clean is dirty. And once you associate someone, a person, with dirty, or you dehumanize the person and take away agency, in my opinion, and what research is also showing from my research study. So hopefully this terminology starts to also be challenged a little bit now with legislative changes focusing more on human rights. For example, recently we had a newspaper article which had a huge title that the recent law will push the country, a country of junkies. And this was the title of a article on a newspaper, which is one of the main newspapers in Malta, and no one complained about the terminology used. And that, in my opinion, is very illustrative how we as a country, we still view people who use drugs. The article was about cannabis, but who cares that the terminology was not even related to to what the article was speaking about. And I think I really hope that these things, together with clean and other terminology, will start to be addressed and researched locally. Because to my knowledge, I don't think there have been any research studies looking at how terminology used locally is detrimental or empowering people who use drugs. I might be wrong, yes? So I need to check well about this.
Yeah.
In
different contexts, definitely.
Sorry, I was just going to say, are you saying in Malta or in general? Locally,
I was saying in Malta, I don't know of any study looking at, in general, yes, I've seen about studies about language, but specific to Malta, no.
Sorry, Fabian, I interrupted you. It was really rude of me.
Oh, I just want to say, I'm pretty confident there are some studies about how certain expressions. I think that wasn't there even a suggestion to completely differently address psychological disorders, so that you actually don't categorize them anymore, because even, I mean, I'm now pushing that everyone is using, stop saying things like addict and dependence, addiction, and particularly the German counterparts, which are sometimes a bit worse than the English translations. But I'm pushing this, substance use disorder, because it's the most scientific one. But even this, I mean, it's depends how you read it, how you comprehend it. It also has some negative connotation. So even this is not optimal. So it's always a tough thing. On the one hand, if 80% does it wrong, when I'm pushing something which is only a little bit wrong, I'm still improving the situation. But yeah, it's still far from perfect. So even my suggestion is far from perfect.
I think, I don't think there's perfection yet. I think there's more neutral terminology that doesn't have any negative connotations or less negative connotations. And then there's I think the most important thing is to use kind of like a person-centered language. So to kind of put people first, so that no label becomes definitive of that person's whole identity. Because I think that's where it becomes problematic. And obviously, this is something that, there's two great works in the context of the kind of social scientific, or I guess criminological, anthropological fields. One is Mary Douglas' Purity and Danger, that was talking about clean and dirty in the context of different societies, and kind of talks about some of the completely pointless and made up associations between dirty and things like period blood that, you know, people just made up because they wanted to control, or they wanted to control, or kind of in some way, you know, were scared of, you know, period blood in women, and they thought that it was dangerous and things like that. So do you see what I mean? So that there are obviously, you know, a kind of religious and ritualistic connections with clean and dirty that have been going on in many societies for a long time. And you know, we need to maybe think about how to come away from that in a society where we have science. and then also, I guess, in relation to, yeah, stigmatizing language, I don't know, it's the same as like when you talk about somebody as a prisoner or a criminal, instead of talking about somebody, a person who has experience of incarceration or has committed an offense, you know, and that thing doesn't define their whole being, but it just becomes something that they've done. And so it's the same with drugs, I think.
People who use drugs.
Yeah, I guess so.
I mean, first language, people first language, I think it's called. It's also, I mean, no natural scientist knows about it. That's also something I learned from the writing styles of my social science colleagues from the Schildower Kreis. That's the German drug expert panel. A bit like the UK drug science folks.
Is it like ACMD, or is it independent? Is it like, so in the UK we have the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, and then we have the Drug Science, which is like the independent one that David Nutt created.
Yeah, I'm in the independent one.
Cool. We like the independent one better.
Yeah, they're usually better. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. So yeah, Karen, you had a question.
Okay, so yes, I had a question here. So we talked a bit about cannabis. In fact, my interventions were a bit one-sided. And it seems that regional development, especially with regards to cannabis, is moving forward in a way. And I wanted to ask you about your views about this, and also if you think a focus on cannabis is in a way replicating a drugs apartheid, leaving other drug users within a criminal field, because all this hype about cannabis is in a way kind of ignoring the plights of other drug users. For example, ecstasy testing, which is still something far away in some countries, although some other countries which have not regulated cannabis are providing drug checking at festivals. So this is also very interesting from a social perspective, and I wanted to ask your views.
Yeah, a difficult question. You can argue in both directions. I mean, on the one hand, the critical mass for cannabis is much bigger. You know, when I was younger, I said for fun, people who like to use speed, at least in I think in Germany, but also I think still Europe. I think it's the drug with the second most also illegal or controlled substance. Illegal drug is even wrong if you think about it. It's because the drug is not illegal. But yeah, but the second the controlled substance with the second highest use prevalence is usually amphetamines. So what we would call a speed or German PEP. So this is I very often said that these, just due to the effect of the drugs, people are more motivated and very often more into, you know, active in society and more, you know, there might be more people pushing this actually just on the effect of the drugs. So luckily, we know it's not like that because it was more that, you know, that people were just scared that they, if they go on demonstrations, that people see that they, you know, consume cannabis and they might lose their driving license, their job. So this was, I think, the main reason why you were not able to see the critical mass. And actually, I think social media also had quite a lot. So, but yeah, if this critical mass have what they are happy with, this might reduce activism. So we even see in for example, the Netherlands that by just having coffee shops. And Germany does not have coffee shops. We see much more activism in Germany. So on a much higher organizational level, at least that's my perception. This is on the one hand, but on the other hand, we also have to say that if we can show that this works with cannabis, we can, and also it's maybe easier to demonstrate that this will also work with, for example, psychedelics or stimulant drugs and pathogens. And also we have to admit there are models. I mean, they are a bit more restrictive than what we're aiming for with cannabis, but there are models for example, for opioid replacement therapy, substitution, even heroin assisted treatment. Of course, this is still with a prescription, but some controlled substance laws like Misuse of Drugs Act, etc., they have been on a national level, they have been changed. So people can get, people who use heroin can get heroin prescribed. So I think it's approaching on both sides. So on the one hand, the critical mass, so high prevalence and let's say low damage, including the prohibition associated damage, and those substances with low prevalence but high damage. Again, heroin would not be so harmful. We wouldn't have overdoses if it would be controlled. And if there would be always clean needle, then there wouldn't be also this spread from HIV, hepatitis, etc. So I think we're approaching from both sides. And the most interesting part, and that's actually one where I probably put my most brain power in, is how to regulate those substances in the middle. So the recreational cocaine powder or the MDMA pill or the ketamine. So this is actually on a regulatory fashion, that's actually the most interesting or most difficult part. So yeah, so cannabis will take out some leverage, but on the other hand, something will have been then achieved, which will help further achievements. But I'm not sure if we are already entering the long-term vision, but I think the one thing is to support every little country with their little activities they are doing for their individual, there is, for example, a high party drug scene in the Netherlands, and it makes perfect, and the UK. So it makes perfect sense to start with drug checking and also maybe decriminalization before regulating the cannabis market, compared to a country where this is not so dominated, like Portugal, where you have a huge heroin and a cocaine scene with intravenous consumption. So for them, it would have made much more sense to go into substitution therapy and decriminalization. And so it also depends a little bit on the country and the focus, but I think at some point there will be some gold standards developed and then hopefully be adopted by other countries. And I think in Europe, we actually have more experiences with drug policy reforms in the hard drug scene. Again, hard drugs, also no good terminology, but so actually we are much further. So in the US, it's the opposite. There we see they have much progress with cannabis, sometimes even to lose, if you ask me. So very, commercialized markets. Still better than prohibition. Don't get me wrong on that. But for example, on the harm reduction front for this, intravenous drug users, people who use intravenously drugs. So difficult. If you tweet, you can take some time for your few words. If you talk, you really have to watch out.
Yeah, so it just takes longer to say the same thing.
Yeah. So in the US, actually, I'm not sure if there is any. I think in Canada they tried it out and was very successful, but still no standard therapy. But there is no heroin for heroin users, and I mean, of course, there shouldn't be coffee shops with heroin, but if someone tells them with a certain level of confidence, "Hey, I'm a user. Look at my arm. Can you please prescribe this to me so my parents I can still visit my parents next year and not OD before?" So I think so. In Europe, we are a bit farther on the hard drug scene. In the US, I think we are a bit on the soft drug scene.
I think your earlier comment related to different organizations and how these, in a way, influence also different services, brings me to my next question exactly. And in fact, I'm very curious about the role of civil society and the scientific community coming together to discuss drug policy and also promote different paradigms and different ways how to deal with this essentially public health and social phenomenon. And I'm interested about the role of ENCOD within a regional approach, but also maybe how do you see the organization in the next 5 years, keeping in mind that certain countries have been now moving to a more human-centered approach to drug policy, and if you feel that this is a positive development, or if maybe you could already see that there will be some barriers which will, apart from the cannabis hype, will maybe stall changes.
I might sound a bit pessimistic, but I think within the next 5 years, it's about using every opportunity to give an opinion. And if there is some, if there is some change going on, to support it. Maybe a few examples from my experience at ENCOD within the last year was, for example, supporting relief. So the Maltese cannabis activists, and I think we wrote several articles, and some of our experts talked to MPs, and I was even invited with another expert on a parliamentary hearing. I mean, this is a simple example where we, what we did was very, very little and very niche, but it still helped the overall case. And so we try to jump in where something is needed and where already something's going on. Another example was, for example, the UN trying to ban or talking about banning Kratom. And I mean, keeping in mind that there are a lot of people in Southeast Asia using it as medicine, and particularly as a substitute for opioids. There is some medical value, and there are also a lot of recreational users without any problems. And this is the majority. So I had the chance to speak at the ECDD, so the WHO's drug expert committee, and explaining them why prohibition is stupid in general, and particularly for Kratom. So this was a lot of fun. So, Kratom is not very big on any radar, but just stopping them from doing another stupid thing, and just trying to stop this vicious circle of banning plants and substances. And then as a third example, this is actually what gave me probably the biggest news attention so far, or public attention in general, was a publication with one person, with a professor from Germany, Heino Stöber. He's famous for the Frankfurtian way, so this accepting, how you call it, accepting drug work, we would say in Germany. So it's about accepting drug use and just helping people, and safe consumption sites, substitution, and clean needles, and even clean needles in prisons, and so on. So, and we were just thinking about how could we do something like a heroin-assisted treatment program for crack cocaine, because crack cocaine, the effects are only a minute long, and you cannot ask people to go into the practice every 5 minutes. There's a logistic problem, and this is how we came up, because he's also doing a lot of work with harm reduction in the tobacco field, so e-cigarettes particularly. And so I just did a theoretical concept for cocaine e-cigarettes. So is it based on the PhysChem properties and the specifications? Is it possible? What benefits it might have? And of course, this and this was then published, and with the provocative title, including cocaine e-cigarette. This triggered a lot of people, and a lot of people interviewed me about it. And But of course, it's a medical device with the purpose of harm reduction. I'm not advocating for this as a recreational drug, because if you inhale a substance, it usually acts quite fast. That means if there is an addictive potential, you're usually increasing the risk. So, so this was really, for people who use crack, who could then instead use this e-cigarette and then less harming their lungs. There is a little overdose limit there based on the half-life, and you get this from a prescribed doctor. So you have to enter the medical system again, while a lot of people who are criminalized, they don't see doctors that often, particularly, and while they are with their physician, they then also address their comorbidities. So their underlying depression, their inflamed, infected arm, which if they will not treat it within the next month, will actually fall off. And seriously, I mean, there are people losing extremities because they don't go to doctors. So it's the overall concept. So I would even say that the social harm reduction part is probably even greater than the pharmacological harm reduction part. But these are those little pieces I try to do in my activist free time, and a lot of it I try to do with ENCOD, and there are a lot of other people who do similar kind of stuff. But it's very, those niche little things to trigger policy changes. But until there's a paradigm shift, I don't think this will be within the next 5 years. I think complete countries need to change. I mean, still, there are hardly any countries applied the Portuguese model, although it's so effective, and it's just decriminalization. I mean, there is not even a regulated market. Regulating markets is very tough, actually. I mean, that's takes a lot of brain power and much more effort than decriminalization. But still, I mean, there's I think some states in the US, and then I think Canada and Norway are talking about it, and I think I recently heard another country. But I mean, still no one, I mean, there's no consensus of decriminalization, although it's saving so much lives. So I think it will take a lot of those little changes within different countries. And then we will need a few countries which actually say, okay, no, we have a paradigm shift because we have a cool cannabis policy, we have a cool party drug policy and psychedelic policy, and we have a cool hard drug policy. For people who only listen, I very often do quotation marks with my fingers. So it's and if countries adopt them, let's say if there's a critical mass of countries, then I can imagine that there's a change on a EU level or on a UN level. But this is something for, let's say, 10 years, and then we still have let's say still a prohibition narrative of, oh, drugs are harmful. So when we come to where I want to be when I'm retired, and I hope I live long enough, this would be actually a point where people can grow and buy their substances with good advice, but without discrimination, without where cannabis is, it sometimes reminds me of how the shift in homosexuality, how it's perceived by the public. Or by politicians who are selling this all the time, because homosexuality was in a lot of countries a crime for a very long time. In Germany until 1994.
94. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's not very long ago, so it was a crime.
We removed it in the 70s.
Good for you. So, but it's not that long ago, but afterwards, it was still perceived by a lot of medical professionals still as an illness. Yeah. So it's and I think for example in Germany it was one of the last 1 or 2 years when it was actually illegal for physicians to offer therapy against homosexuality. It's
So are you saying that it goes from like criminalizing to pathologizing to normalizing?
Exactly.
Or something
That's
like
exactly
that.
the point I want to make. I mean, I don't want to say, I mean, there are people with a problematic use, but it's still debatable if it's the the main fault of the drug, or if they just do doing a self-therapy, which is not ideal. There's still a whole debate about is addiction actually something real? I mean, there's something like withdrawal effects and tolerance. I mean, this is something you can measure, but this the social construct of addiction. I mean, how much is it symptom? I mean, you would not say to a person who has diabetes, you would not say, okay, yeah, if you cannot get rid of the insulin, then you have an issue. Let's please reduce it. Yeah, please go lower and lower. Here you have to switch to metformin, which for the easier diabetes cases. And for some people it will not work. If they're diabetes 1, if I'm not mistaken, metformin is not working. I'm not 100% sure on it, but people, there are certain circumstances where you get drugs and no one argues about that. And it's just this thing, okay, if it has to do with pleasure, then we want to ban it. And if we cannot ban it, we still want to discriminate and pathologize people. And again, in the LGBT community, it's the same people who are doing this. And it's very often coined by religious thoughts and Puritanism. So we see some similarities there. And I hope that at some point a non-problematic drug use, that that it will be something normal. And I don't think a world is great where everyone tries to be as abstinent as possible. I think people have to find the right balance for themselves, and this can be quite different. And I mean, and if it's just about, okay, yeah, but if these people takes all the time drugs to feel better, then this person cannot work. If there's no other solution for this person, then it's that this person's fucking right. And if you think about people with disabilities, it's the same. I mean, there is no reason to force people into labor. I mean, if labor is not a thing for them, then they shouldn't work. Yeah, they should get an offer. They should get, and if there are other factors, for example, why they cannot work, because there is no proper elevator for a wheelchair. I mean, that's a different topic. But the main goal of a person's life is not to work and pay taxes. And yeah, no, I'm probably getting too left.
This is getting too political, Fabian. Come on. No, but seriously, I mean, I think you've got some really good points there. I really like your idea that every opportunity should be used to educate people, even if it's a niche thing in the context of very discrete and small kind of reform or change. And I also feel like, there is, I think in a way, maybe our obsession with productivity in kind of maybe like late capitalism pushes us towards judging people really harshly if they can't be productive in a traditional way, despite the fact that a lot of labor is going to become obsolete because we have automation. So it's just like a weird kind of thing that we're going sort of towards, that it's going to hopefully create some positive changes, and even in the context of drug policy. But I agree with you that it will take a long time.
Yeah. Also, the unconditional income. I'm in principle in favor, but I'm not an expert in the field. So, but it's also a very, very interesting debate, and particularly as we also have to reduce at least a certain type of productivity.
Yeah.
Due to climate change. I mean, associated with CO2.
Yeah.
And this is also a reason why to stop this stupid drug war. I mean,
we're still in regimes where people say we have to, we're like, that will make people lazy, and people will be lazy if we give them money and stuff like that. That's kind of the main political thrust is that. But yeah, you're right. There are also very real climate change reasons why we should apply drug policy reform.
And if you don't enable people and give them opportunities, I mean, this might be even true that people without money lose some sort of motivation, but this is then an intrinsic problem we have to solve differently, by creating those opportunities to create some social gain. And so it's I think it's a huge topic and a bit difficult to address.
Yeah, it is.
I'm also lacking some expertise there.
Yeah, I think it was just like, let's keep it with drug policy. It's fine. But yeah, anyway, no, it's great. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, and it's really great listening to you. And I really like the fact that you go off on tangents like me. Yay! And yeah, thanks so much for all those who have listened to this podcast, and we'll be back for more in the next few weeks. Thanks again, Fabian, and thanks, Karen. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.